pulled the valve cover back off, which right now is just acting as a dust cover, because we still have to adjust the valves once this engine's up to operating temperature while it's idling, which is really fun to do because you're throwing the oil everywhere. But first thing I'm going to do, because I want to put my push rods in first, I'm going to take off this little side cover. This way I can see and make sure that I get all of the push rods in the center of the lifter. I'm going to put some of the engine assembly grease in it on all of our lifters, or the push rod ends on both ends. Yeah, so they're not dry when they first start. Now this engine does not oil through push rods like some of your small block V8s do. So the rods are solid, so you don't really have to worry about plugging the oil hole with this grease. I'm just dipping them down in the grease. And slide them down in here and line them up. I'm going to speed this up so y'all don't see or have to deal with the boredom of me putting push rods in. But they do go behind your diesel line. Now I'm just going to come up here to the top, put a dollop of grease in each little cup. Okay. And while I'm covered in this stuff, I'm going to go ahead and put some onto my valve spring tips. Or not the valve spring, but the valve tips. That's my intakes, and then I'm going to put a little dab just on these exhaust ones. Because if you remember, we got to put our little lash caps on here first. Don't forget our little lash caps on our exhaust valves. And now we'll put a little grease on top of those guys. So unfortunately they have a little bit of oil on them, and this stuff dissolves in oil. Alright, so now I'm ready to put the rocker arm assembly onto it. And there'll be a separate video of me disassembling in this shaft and cleaning it all up. But it basically just sets down in here, just like we took it off. I've got it so loose I can't really line it up very easily. Now for the bolts that bolt this down, just like I did on our head bolts, I'm going to put a little bit of ARP Ultra Torque on them. Now this big bolt goes in the very last one. It actually threads all the way into the block. These other 4 bolts and we'll say bolt 1 through 5 here. Bolt 4 and bolt 2 have just lock washers. Bolts 1 and 3 have little metal tabs to hold our oil pipes in. Okay, so I got these other 2 bolts in. So now the last 2 bolts have our little tabs that hold these 2 pipes in here. Your front pipe has nothing on it. Your other pipe that goes on bolt 3, has a square cut O-ring that goes right here. It goes down into that hole. That is our oil feed pipe to our valve train. Always change that. Which is a little part that I have right here. And unfortunately the part numbers wore off here, so I can't really read it to you. But you can buy those anywhere. First bolt in your oil tube, I'll slide the oil tube down in to your rocker support on number 1. Put a little bit of ultra torque on our bolt. Slide our lock tab on, lock washer, and our bolt. Thankfully it lined up to start, so that's great. Get this new O-ring put on this pipe. And the old one was hard and brittle, so I had to kind of fight to get it off. Just slide this down on. Whenever this goes on, you need to make sure that it is flat the whole way around and not twisted. I'm going to take a little bit of silicone, or lubricating silicone, and we'll lube up that O-ring just to help slide it in a little easier. Slide it through the hole in our head. Then we'll slide it down into the engine block, which apparently all my silicone got rubbed off right there in the head gasket. So now I have this other tube installed. And I had to really press on mine to get it in there, but it'll go. Let's stick our bolt number 3 in. Okay, torque spec on our rocker bolts 45 to 55. I'm going to go in the middle at 50. And just like everything else, start from the middle and go out. This tube here, when you tighten it down, try to make sure that it just goes straight down in between these two valve springs and it doesn't touch them, because sometimes it'll want to move on you like that. Change sockets for the last big bolt. Now just double check everything again. Okay, now there's the rocker arm assembly installed. Okay, so I want to do an initial valve adjustment for the simple fact that this engine has to be running to adjust the valves. It has to be up to operating temperature. However, I cannot run an engine like that. So I need to get these things close. The way that you adjust a valve, you want the camshaft to be on base circle. In other words, no lift or any kind. And then you adjust your gap between your rocker arm and your valve. And you adjust it by turning these little adjuster guys. See, right now, these two lifters here are down. This one's up a little bit. That one kind of looks up. But what I want to do is I want to have both of these on the base circle. And I want to take a feeler gauge, stick them in between the rocker and the spring to get an initial valve lash of about 15 thousandths. And about the easiest way to find out if you're on base circle, if you got one valve open, like your intake or your exhaust rather, because that's what I'm pointing at here. The exhaust is open, the intake is probably on base circle. So that's the one where you would adjust. And then you're spinning around until the intake opens, and then your exhaust will be on base. So you're going to then adjust the exhaust. The other option is having both of these on base circle on top dead center compression. Any one of those methods will work. Which I can tell you that I have left this engine so far with the number one piston up. So this one's on compression right now. There's my 15 thousandths feeler gauge. I'm going to take a wrench, which is 7/16, and I'm going to start just spinning these adjusters down. And they are very stiff due to the type of threading that's on them. Plus you don't want these backing out with the engine running. You can see just how I've tightened that, how that's gotten tighter versus this guy. This is the one I've started to adjust down. That one's not adjusted. Okay. I'm basically going to take that gauge and just slide it in there until I feel a drag. Now, another way you can do this, and this is how I'm going to do it once I actually have it up and running, I do a go, no go. So if I want 15 thousandths, I'll have a 15 and a 16 thousandths. And I'll make the 15 thousandths fit and the 16 thousandths not fit. So as long as I have it set that way, then I know I'm in the right spec. And you can see how much that one moves now versus that guy. And there's the 15 thousandths sliding under it. Now, like I said, this is not the final. This is just an initial to get the tractor to start and run whenever that time comes. And here I'm just doing the same thing to the intake. Okay, now that one's tight. This is actually how I want them to be, where I have to kind of force that in there. Because whenever this thing's up to operating temperature, this gap is going to expand. So I want them a little on the tight side, but not so tight that I can't push this gauge in there. So that one there is actually on the verge of too tight, but I'm going to leave it for now. Okay, so there's that valve, or this cylinder set on their valve lash. And then I just have to do the other thing to the other 3 cylinders. Now you can follow the firing order if you're going to do it on compression stroke. Which, if you're going to follow the firing order, what you want to see is you're wanting to see this intake come up. Right here, you want to see this intake lifter come up and then go back down. And when that goes all the way back down, you're going to be coming up on compression. So then you'll be ready to adjust these two. So let's see, this is the exhaust on number 3. Here's the intake on number 3. Which is coming up. So with this intake valve here, or this tappet coming up, I know that this number 3 exhaust is on base. So I now can go ahead and adjust this guy. And this is the other way of doing it. Whenever one's on, when one valve is open, the other one is more than likely on base circle. Now the exception to that is you have what's called valve overlap. And that occurs whenever they just start to open and close, based on camshaft design. So to try to avoid that overlap, you want to get as far into the event, the valve event, as possible. Like, you want to be sure this lifter's way up to know that this one's way down. Like, you don't want to see just this barely move and then adjust. You want to go further than that. So keep track of which ones you've done. For me, it's easy because all of mine are backed way out from where I cleaned this assembly. So I can tell which ones I've done and which ones I haven't done. So keep track of them. Especially if you're going to jump around. You're following the base circle method. If you do the firing order method, it's not so bad because you just follow your firing order. Okay, so that one's good. So I went from number 1 to number 3 exhaust. So now I'm going to come back down here and watch which one moves. Of course, there is easier ways to do this. You can follow the manual. It'll tell you do this valve and that valve and this valve and that valve. But I'm kind of just watching to see which one's open and which one's closed. So this valve here is starting to open. So since this valve here is starting to open on me, this valve here should be ready to be adjusted. However, be aware that this is an intake or an exhaust valve. Well, right after your exhaust valve opens, your intake's going to open. So there may be an overlap issue here. Because now that valve's starting to come down, so this one's going to open up. You see this one's pushed way out now, so this one's still on base, which is good. This one's still up. So let me go ahead now and adjust this one. Okay, so that one's tight. So far I've done both on number 1, intake number 2, exhaust number 3. So I spin this over more since this is the exhaust valve that's open on number 2. Here shortly I should see I think I said it right. This was the exhaust valve on number 2 that's open. So here in a second I should see the intake open, at which point I can then adjust the exhaust here, which then just leaves me these 3 guys. Which, this one is up. Well, it might have been up, I don't know now, as my lifter is sticking due to the assembly grease. But I'm probably coming up on compression on number 4. Okay, so like I said, I just adjusted this guy because it was on base circle. So now we're seeing this lifter come up to open up our intake valve. So now I'm going to let it go back down a little bit. So now we know this one's on base. Because now that this valve's closed, this is technically starting to get ready to come up on a compression stroke. So let's tighten this exhaust valve. And one thing, whenever you check your exhaust, you're checking on top of the little caps. You're on top of the cap between the rocker arm. Okay, so there's that guy. So now I have these first 5 valves set. So now if I can just get these back 3 to where I want them to go. Okay, so we got number 3 exhaust opening here. And I have number 4 intake open. Our intake now has went down. So we're coming up on a compression stroke on number 4. So let's adjust our exhaust on number 4. So I know this sounds really confusing, but basically, whichever stroke the motor is on, adjust the other valve. It's about the easiest way you can understand it. Or adjust them on, both of them on the compression stroke. So it's like right now, we just saw the intake open. So we're on intake stroke. So I'm adjusting the exhaust valve. And obviously the next stroke of the engine is going to be compression. So I could wait and do the exhaust and intake on the compression stroke, and it'd be perfectly fine. But I can go ahead and do this since this is on the base circle of the camshaft. Okay. So now I'm looking for this valve to open and this valve to open. When these 2 valves open, these 2 can be adjusted. Okay, so this valve, number 4 exhaust, is open. So I can do number 4 intake now. Okay, so then there was 1. Now I want to see number 3 exhaust open. It's right there. So there's all my valves adjusted. And like I say, I know it looks confusing in that video because everything was so loose. But basically, as you see how this valve is higher than this one, since this is our intake, we don't want the exhaust open when we're trying to pull fresh intake air, right? So while this valve here, this guy, is up, we know that this exhaust valve is closed. Therefore, on base circle of our cam. So that's the one we would adjust. See, here's the same scenario. This one here is open, which is exhaust. So since the exhaust is open, our intake is closed. We want to adjust our intake. And then you get down here to like these guys, where both of them look closed. Probably one of these is on compression and one of them is probably on the power stroke. That's why both valves are closed. These are getting ready to start their sequence, or as the case of this guy, it's finishing, and these two are closed in the middle of the cycle. See, like right now, number 1 exhaust is starting to come up, which tells me that that is on the exhaust stroke. Therefore, my engine, if I was to stick my timing in here right now, it'd be 180 out. So I'm trying to get it back to number 1 compression. What that was. Now see, here's my intake opening on number 1. So right now I should be on the compression stroke for this number 1. Which unfortunately, the only way to really check it on this engine is to put flywheel on it to check timing. Because there's no timing marks anywhere up front, I can't stick my hand in a spark plug tube. But even then, that's not going to tell me exactly when I'm at TDC. So I have to get it close and then use my flywheel markings to get it dead on. This should be coming up on compression stroke here on number 1. And I want to do that for the simple fact I have not put in my injection pump drive. And then once I cover all this up, which the valve cover is just going to sit there since I have to do the valve adjustment with it running and up to 10. But this one I'm going to close up and seal up. Well, I want this to go ahead and be on number 1 compression. Yeah. That way whenever I put the flywheel on it and line it up, it'll be on the compression stroke and it won't be 180 degrees out. It's basically just trying to think down the road here. But that's how you adjust the valves.
This side cover, I can go ahead and fully bolt down now. Now the side cover takes this gigantic piece of cork rubber. And this thing should only line up on your holes in one way. Yeah, because your center hole here is off. So that little recess, or well, it's not really a recess, it's an opening, goes down here towards your pump or your distributor. As far as siliconing this, I probably won't silicone it just because it's kind of a pain in the hind end in its location. Now in your rebuild kit, you'll get these new grommets. There's two different ones here. You got your side cover and your valve cover up top. And your valve cover up top will have a washer already built into it. However, you're going to add another one to it. Your side cover doesn't have a washer built in, but you will put another flat washer on it. Not to mention you have 3 of these and 2 of these. So the torque on this guy is 20 to 30 inch-pounds, which is basically 2 foot-pounds. So it's not very tight. I mean, you can probably do about 2 foot-pounds with your bare hands. Now, whenever you put these in, just make sure that the grommet goes into the cover, or else you'll have a leak. There's 25 on that one. It's 25. Okay, and I just torqued them to 25 inch-pounds. So that covers on and sealed. So the next one's going to be the valve cover. They also get this big old cork gasket. And your best way to do it is just to install it into the cover, since it has little tangs, fingers, holders, whatever you want to call it. That'll help to hold this gasket in place. Just like so. And torque on this is like 1 to 2 inch-pounds, so I mean they just want it just snug is all. And whenever I final install this after adjusting the valves, I'll come in here and put some silicone on top of these little guys to help seal this up. And also on my head, for some reason there's a little nick here at the front, and I may put a little bit there. But we'll put on our grommets up here, and for the time being, I mainly want these on there far enough to where I could just stick the washer and the nut on here so I can get them painted like that. Whenever I finally put them down initially, or final, I'll probably make that rubber
expand a little bit, probably to the size of the washer, and that'll be as tight as I'm going to make them. And the last piece I want to stick in here, I want to just put the gasket for this breather in, and that's just so it gets painted blue on the outside edge, so I don't have an ugly gasket sticking out. This is this little cork deal. So now, with the exception of the drive, the dipstick, and the filter element, the engine is now rebuilt. And I'm getting ready to clean mine up and get it painted. And I'll put that at the end of this video so you can see what it looks like. And then once I get the rest of the tractor rebuilt, we'll be able to fire this thing up.
Okay, here's a look at the engine sitting outside, all fully painted. As you can see, I put a couple of the brass pieces back onto it. Here's the side of the left front. Kind of hard to see my camera, so hopefully I'm getting everything in good frame here. Nice and bright out here today. But if anyone's wondering, I primed the motor using some PPG epoxy primer, and then I followed this up with blue enamel from New Holland, along with a little bit of magic hardener in it, and just a slight splash of some xylol thinner just to help it lay down a little bit easier. That's the finished result. Now I just got to get the rest of it done so I can fire it up.